I have admired the British journalist Malcolm Muggeridge for something like 40 years. Back in the 1970s, Muggeridge was the most well-known journalist in the entire world. I've got two shelves full of his books. And one of these, entitled The Third Testament, introduced me to the essential insights of the poet William Blake, who wrote about seeing either with or through the eyes. Choosing to see with or through your eyes, according to Blake, determines your vision of reality. Seeing through the eye, as Ian Hunter says, was Mr. Muggeridge's particular gift. He saw through the eye what so many others of greater fame and status could not see because they saw only with the eye. Now, as Tom Sowell points out in his book, A Conflict of Visions, a certain way of seeing is running and ordering our lives. We may not even be aware of it, but our way of seeing is there, beneath the surface, and is silently and powerfully determining what we see and what we care about. So because of the presence of this particular way of seeing deeply lodged within us, it can often be predicted how each of us will respond to a whole range of issues. In fact, people appear predictably to line up on opposing sides of any given issue because of their particular vision or their underlying vision. And yet, regardless of how deeply we may be in the grip of the particular lens through which we're looking, shifts in perspective do occur. Sometimes the shifts can be dramatic, as was the case in Malcolm Muggeridge's life experience. Now, I somehow knew when I was 20 years old that Muggeridge and I shared the same way of looking and therefore the same vision of reality. I knew it intuitively then. And now, as I said, I'm getting old, I've got almost like 40 years to confirm this initial recognition. When I first saw Mr. Muggeridge speak at the University of Victoria in 1974, I was ecstatic. I sat in the front row on the edge of my seat. I thought he was brilliant and radiated only goodness and wisdom. What I didn't understand and was dismayed to observe at the time was the presence of a very evident hostility towards him. I mean, not a few were mocking and scornful of this seer. Well, when Malcolm Muggeridge was growing up, he was infused with a particular vision of how the world was, or at least of how it was supposed to be. So he remembers when he was a little boy, the little suburban house in South London, where he says on Saturday evenings, my father and his cronies would assemble and they would plan together the downfall of the capitalist system and the replacement of it by one which was just and human and egalitarian and peaceable, etc. It is what Muggeridge later would call the great liberal death wish. A great utopian fantasy was being held before people's eyes, and many would swallow the vision whole. Says Muggeridge, I accepted completely the views of these good men, that once they were able to shape the world as they wanted it to be, they would create a perfect state of affairs in which peace would reign, prosperity would expand, men would be brotherly and considerate, and there would be no exploitation of man by man, not any ruthless oppression of individuals. Muggeridge says about these men, they were good men, they were honest men, they were sincere men. My father used to speak a lot at open-air meetings, and when I was very small, I used to follow him around because I adored him. In a word, Malcolm Muggeridge grew up a socialist and saw the world through the particular lens of left-wing collectivism. He even married the niece of two of the most famous socialists of the time, Beatrice and Sidney Webb, which he describes as like marrying into a sort of aristocracy of the left. It was entirely fitting, therefore, that he got his start as a journalist with the Manchester Guardian, which he describes as the high citadel of liberalism. As he put it, that's where the truth was being expounded. There was where enlightenment reigned. In due course, as Muggeridge continues, I was asked to join the editorial staff of The Guardian, which to me was a most marvelous thing. These were the golden days of liberalism, where The Guardian was widely read and even believed. It was clear to Muggeridge that as a member of The Guardian staff, he was to write within the confines of their particular vision of reality. He says we were required to end anything we wrote on a hopeful note, because liberalism is a hopeful creed. And so, however appalling and black the situation we described, we would always conclude with some sentence like, "It is greatly to be hoped that moderate men of all shades of opinion will draw together, and that wiser counsels may yet prevail." How many times I gave expression to such jejune hopes. What jolted Muggeridge out of this vision was what he calls the extraordinary performance of the Liberal Intelligentsia, who in those days flocked to Moscow like pilgrims to Mecca. And they were one and all utterly delighted and excited by what they saw there. Clergymen walked serenely and happily through the anti-God museums. Politicians claimed that no system of society could possibly be more equitable and just. Lawyers admired Soviet justice, and economists praised the Soviet economy. How could this be, Muggeridge asked? How could this extraordinary credulity exist in the minds of people who were adulated by one and all as maestros of discernment and judgment? In other words, why were these intelligent people so stupid? Indeed, why were so many educated intellectuals so unperceiving? Why were they so blind? Well, their inability to see, or refusal to see, illustrates my point once again about just how deeply a way of looking can be lodged within us. In this case, the maestros of discernment and judgment did not see or could not see because of the distortions of reality caused by their leftist delusions. Well, when I met Muggeridge as a university student, and I began to read him, I knew that his vision was radically at odds with what I was receiving at my local university, described at the time as Canada's most radically left-wing institution. And so to counter that biased education, I eagerly devoured the writings of Malcolm Muggeridge to ground myself in his vision of reality, which has remained with me ever since. Now, at one point, Muggeridge asked a great question. The question had to do with where it is that we could expect to find the greatest wisdom. And looking around, where are you going to find it? Where might we find the most perfect and beautiful expressions of man's spiritual aspirations? Well, the answer he gave, with the force of a revelation, was to say that the discovery of high aspirations and vision did not come from the liberal dream in any of its manifestations, but from the forced labor camps of the USSR. Here, in my estimate, is a staggering clarity. Wouldn't you know it, that the clearest seeing would arise from the greatest suffering? The clearest seeing and understanding came from those who had lost everything that could be seen and valued with ordinary eyes. Through losing everything, those who suffered discovered a deeper way of seeing and understanding. Says Muggeridge, I was reading about it in a long essay by a Yugoslav writer who spent many years in a prison in Yugoslavia. He cites case after case of people who, like Solzhenitsyn, found that enlightenment came to them in the forced labor camps. They understood what freedom was when they lost their freedom. They understood what the purpose of life was when they seemed to have no future. Muggeridge goes on to say, they say, moreover, that when it's a question of choosing whether to save your soul or your body, the man who chooses to save his soul gathers strength thereby to go on living, whereas the man who chooses to save his body at the expense of his soul loses both body and soul. In other words, fulfilling exactly what our Lord said, that he who hates his life in this world shall keep his life for all eternity, as those who love their lives in this world will assuredly lose them. Now that concludes, Mr. Muggeridge, is light in our darkness. So there is, as Muggeridge is saying, a fundamental difference between those who choose to save their souls, that's their focus, and those who love their life in this world, that's theirs. The latter, that is the life lovers, which means those who live life as if this is all there is, are those who merely see with their eyes. That is, they see with their physical eyes only. They're the ones who love their life in this world, which is to say they do not see beyond it. This world, for them, is all there is. The result of this facile way of seeing, according to William Blake, is the distortion of reality. To see only with your physical eyes is to see with jaundiced, worldly eyes. To see in such a circumscribed way makes you, as well, vulnerable to lies, especially to utopian promises. It's the long-term practice of seeing with the eyes only, without reference to that deeper spiritual seeing through the eyes, that explains the extraordinary credulity of the intelligentsia. They refuse to see what did not correspond with their blinding point of view. Muggeridge explains their sightlessness thus: we live in a dark, self-enclosed prison, which is all we see or know if our glance is fixed ever downwards. Now, on the other hand, there is that way of seeing through the eyes that is related to the choice of saving our souls, that's the priority. As Muggeridge says, in this mode, to live our glance upwards, to lift our glance upwards, is to become aware of the wide, luminous universe outside. And about this, Muggeridge says, this alone is happiness, like to see beyond this world. So was the conviction of Mr. Malcolm Muggeridge that even though the whole world might eventually be covered with concrete, that there would still be some cracks in it, and that through these cracks green shoots would come? The testimonies from the labor camps are the green shoots we can see in the world breaking out from the monolithic power now dominating ever greater areas of it. It's the green shoots of a deeper seeing which will continue to spring up, that will continue to break up and through the concrete in spite of the power of totalitarian enclosures. Now, for myself, I'm living, however poorly, in the vision of Malcolm Muggeridge, in that reality that he cared about, which is the way of seeing advocated by the poet William Blake.